So we're continuing in today's Mishna Yomi, and today we find ourselves in Perek Gimel, Mishnayos Dalid through Hey. Mishnayos 4 through 5. So Mishnah Dalid says as follows. Hamodechitin letoche inkusi, or letoche ama aretz. So this is an interesting case. If a person goes ahead and brings his wheat. Now remember again, we're talking about, I'm bringing my wheat to a tochen. Tochen is a grinder. So I'm taking my wheat in order for someone to grind it into flour. Now the situation over here is, I'm bringing wheat that has already been properly tithed. And I'm bringing it to the grinder who is a kusi or an ama aretz. Remember again, the kusim are a group of individuals who converted, but whose conversion is subject to a halachic dispute as to whether or not it is an authentic or proper conversion. This is a whole discussion the Gemara has about kusim. Are they gerei emes? Are they proper converts? Are they what they call gerei arayos? Are they instead converts who only converted as a result of an outbreak of lions? This is arayos with an aleph and not with an ayin, which means immorality. So there's a whole discussion. So in halach in general, we're often unsure about how to treat the kusim. So in any event, here the Mishnah says, I bring my wheat, I have tithed wheat, and I bring it to an ama aretz, someone who's ignorant about the laws of Trumas and Maasros, or a kusi. What's the halacha? So essentially, the wheat maintains its chazaka, maintains its status regarding meiser and shmita. Now what that means effectively is that halacha l'maisa, we assume that what I gave the kusi, or what I gave the amaretz, is exactly what they give me back. In other words, there is no concern that perhaps the kusi or the amaretz will swap my produce for someone else's produce. However, again, contrast that with letochin ovei kochavim. But again, if I go ahead and I give it to an ovei kochavim akum, a non-Jew who is grinding the wheat, demai. So in this case, the wheat I get back is demai and has to be retithed. So you see that when it comes to a grinder who's non-Jewish, there is a concern that perhaps he swapped my produce with something else, and therefore, whereas I gave him tithed produce, the concern is that maybe he gave me back something which was untithed. Therefore, again, when I get it back from him, I have to effectively retithe it. Hamafkid perosav etzel kusio etzel ama aretz bechazkas l'maisros l'shvius. So same idea. If I go ahead and let's say I deposit, I have produce that is tithed, and I give it to a kusi or to an ama aretz to watch over it. I give it to them to watch over it. In other words, that we assume same idea. What I gave them is what I get back, and therefore, if I gave them tithed produce, then halacha l'maisa, I assume that what I gave them is exactly what I got back. Eitzel oved kochavim. But here's what's interesting: if I deposit fruit with an oved kochavim, kiperosav, then we assume that perhaps the akum went ahead and swapped my fruit for his fruit. Now, here's what's interesting about that. That actually doesn't pose a halachic problem, because halacha l'maisa, again, the produce of an akum is not subject to any levels of trumas and maasros, or shmita for that matter. So therefore, even if he did swap it, it doesn't really have a halachic implication for me. Rabbi Shimon Omer Demai. Rabbi Shimon says, no, however, if you deposit your produce with an akum, with a non-Jew, there's the potential for that he swapped it, but it's also possible that he swapped it for someone else's produce, not his own. And therefore, again, it's possible that maybe although you gave him tithed produce, maybe he's giving you back untithed produce. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon says you have to treat the produce like demai, and therefore you would have an obligation to go ahead and retithe it. Beautiful. Mishnah Hey, fifth Mishnah. Ha nosin la pundakis, ma'as reshu nosin la, ve'eshu not la limenas. This is an interesting case. So the Bartanura explains as follows. It was common that when a person would go ahead and check into an inn, they would bring food with them, but often ingredients, and they would give it to the innkeeper, and the innkeeper would go ahead and prepare for them a meal with the ingredients that I brought. So the Mishnah says as follows: when I go ahead and I give food, I give ingredients to the pundakis, to the innkeeper, I have to tithe whatever I give her. Now, why is that? Because at the end of the day, this is a general halacha that you're not permitted to give someone something that is untithed. And since there is a concern about potentially swapping it, if they do swap it, we don't want them to end up eating untithed produce. So therefore, I have to tithe the produce before I give it to the pundakis, the innkeeper. And whatever she gives me back, I have to retithe again, because there is the real concern that perhaps she swapped that which I gave her with something else. And Rabbi Yossi says, no, ein anu achra'in l'ramoin. Rabbi Yossi says, not true. We are not responsible for people who engage in deceptive practices. Eino ma'aser ela mashu noto emena bilbad. You do not have to tithe that which you give the innkeeper, rather you only have to tithe that which you give back. In other words, Rabbi Yossi says, if I'm going to give someone my ingredients and they're going to use it and swap it for something else, that's an act of theft. If they're going to be a thief, I don't have a halachic obligation to go ahead and take care of the thief. So therefore, again, to cause a person to double tithe, essentially, again, tithe before I give the ingredients and then tithe when I get back the finished product, that's incorrect. Therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, halacha l'maisi, you don't have to tithe the produce before you give it to the innkeeper. You just have to tithe it when you get it back from her. Wonderful. Shkayach Havano, stop over for today. Wishing everyone a good Chodesh and a good Shabbos, and we'll continue Matei Shabbos.